25 foods you'd find in a Canadian Pioneer Tavern. Imagine stepping into a wooden tavern along a dusty Canadian Pioneer road. The smell of wood smoke, damp leather, and something hearty bubbling over the fire. These were not fancy dining halls, but the beating hearts of early communities, where settlers, loggers, fur traders, and weary travelers gathered for warmth, company, and food that could fill a hungry stomach after a hard day's work. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Canadian taverns and roadside inns were more than just places to drink. They were gathering spots where pioneers traded stories, planned their futures, and shared meals that reflected the harsh realities and simple joys of early life in Canada. The menus weren't glamorous, but they told the story of survival, resourcefulness, and a growing nation stitched together by food traditions borrowed from Indigenous peoples, French settlers, British loyalists, and immigrant communities. Today, many of those foods are forgotten, buried in dusty cookbooks, or remembered only in family stories. But in their time, these dishes were essential. They warmed frozen bodies, offered a rare taste of sweetness, and gave settlers the strength to endure another day of backbreaking work. So let's journey together through 25 foods you might have found in a Canadian Pioneer Tavern. Starting with one humble bread that fed fur traders, soldiers, and settlers alike, bannock.
If bannock filled the table, pea soup with salt pork filled the soul. This thick, hearty soup was the dish that carried countless Canadians through the bitter cold of winter nights. Split pea soup has its roots in French Canada, where settlers brought recipes from Normandy and adapted them to the New World. The main ingredients, dried yellow peas and salted pork, were perfect for the frontier. They kept well without refrigeration, traveled easily, and could be simmered for hours on a tavern's hearth. In pioneer taverns, a pot of pea soup was almost always on the fire, its aroma drifting through the smoky air and drawing in weary travelers. This dish wasn't just food, it was fuel. Pea soup provided protein and warmth at a time when physical labor dominated life. Farmers who had spent the day in frozen fields, or voyageurs returning from weeks on the rivers, could sit down to a bowl that was both filling and familiar. For taverns, it was cheap to prepare and could feed large groups without fuss. Over time, pea soup became a symbol of French-Canadian hospitality, especially when paired with that slab of fresh bannock bread. For many, pea soup carried a taste of home across generations. Families passed down their own versions, often with secret additions like herbs, onions, or even a splash of vinegar. But perhaps the most nostalgic part is its connection to memory. Even today, older Canadians remember walking into kitchens on snowy evenings and being greeted by the smell of pea soup bubbling on the stove. It was more than a meal. It was a reminder that no matter how hard the world outside was, there was warmth waiting inside. 3. Pemmican. Long before taverns dotted the frontier, pemmican was already keeping people alive. For fur traders, voyageurs, and settlers alike, it wasn't just food, it was survival packed into a pouch. Pemmican originated with the indigenous peoples of the plains and was later adopted by the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company. It was made by drying strips of bison or venison, pounding them into a powder, and then mixing that meat with rendered fat. Sometimes dried berries were added for flavor and vitamins. The result was a dense, high-calorie food that could last for months without spoiling. In Canada's pioneer taverns and roadhouses, pemmican was sometimes offered to travelers heading deep into the wilderness because it was the most reliable food they could carry. No single food shaped Canada's early fur trade more than pemmican. It was lightweight, easy to transport, and provided immense energy for voyageurs paddling canoes across rivers or hauling furs through portages. For taverns near trade routes, offering pemmican meant catering to the very people who were building the economy of early Canada. Beyond nourishment, it also symbolized the blending of Indigenous knowledge with settler needs, a reminder that survival often depended on cultural exchange. Yet pemmican wasn't always just a food. It became the cause of conflict, most famously during the Pemmican War of 1814, when rival fur traders clashed over its control. For many, a single sack of pemmican meant the difference between life and death on a frozen trail. Today, the idea of eating a ball of dried meat and fat might seem unappetizing, but for those who lived it, pemmican was the very definition of survival. But survival foods weren't always so plain. When tavern keepers had access to the river's bounty, they served dishes that were both hearty and fresh, like stewed salmon and trout. What's the most Canadian food you've ever tried? For me, it's this: stewed salmon and trout. Nothing connected pioneers to Canada's rivers and lakes more closely than a pot of stewed fish. It was the taste of the wilderness, pulled straight from the water and simmered by the fire. Canada's waterways were lifelines, providing transportation, trade, and food. Salmon in the west and trout in the east were abundant and easily caught, making them staples in pioneer diets. In taverns along trade routes or near fishing settlements, stewed salmon and trout became reliable dishes. The fish were often cut into chunks, cooked slowly with onions, herbs, and sometimes a splash of vinegar or cider for flavor. It wasn't fancy, but it was filling and it carried the freshness of the land around them. For many settlers, it was their introduction to local ingredients they had never tasted in Europe. Serving salmon and trout also symbolized abundance. Unlike salted pork or dried peas, this was food that could be caught and eaten the same day. In taverns, it was a luxury to eat something fresh, a reminder that life on the frontier still had its comforts. Not every tavern dish was about meat or fish. Sometimes the humblest vegetables told the greatest story of survival. Cabbage and potato hash was one such dish, a simple meal that filled bellies when little else was on hand. Cabbage and potatoes were staples in Canadian pioneer kitchens because they stored well through long winters. Potatoes, easy to grow in rocky soil, and cabbage, hardy against frost, became essential ingredients for survival. In taverns, leftover scraps of boiled cabbage and potatoes were fried together in a pan with drippings from pork or beef. The result was a rustic hash, crispy at the edges, soft in the middle, and often topped with onions if they were available. It wasn't glamorous, but it was practical, and it kept hunger at bay. This dish symbolized resourcefulness. In pioneer times, wasting food was unthinkable, and cabbage and potato hash was the perfect way to make use of every scrap. For immigrant communities, especially Irish settlers, it echoed the dishes of home while adapting to Canadian conditions. In taverns, it was cheap to prepare and could be served quickly, making it a reliable filler meal for travelers who didn't have the coins for pricier stews or roasts. For many Canadians, the memory of cabbage and potato hash is tied to poverty as much as comfort. Families struggling through the Depression or wartime rationing often leaned on this same dish, handed down through generations. What some remember as poor food was also a lifeline that sustained thousands. Today, hearing grandparents recall the smell of fried cabbage wafting through a small farmhouse kitchen reminds us that even the simplest foods can carry deep stories of endurance. When sugar was scarce and luxuries were few, Canadians still found ways to bring sweetness to the table. The answer was molasses pie, a humble dessert that carried both comfort and ingenuity. Molasses arrived in Canada through trade routes from the Caribbean and quickly became a staple sweetener, especially when refined sugar was too costly or unavailable. Pioneer taverns often used it to make simple baked goods, and one of the most beloved creations was molasses pie. The filling was made by combining molasses with flour, butter, and sometimes vinegar or spices, then baking it into a thick, sticky custard-like dessert. It was hearty, inexpensive, and used ingredients that could be stored for long periods, perfect for frontier kitchens. For travelers stopping at taverns, molasses pie was more than dessert. It was a taste of celebration in an otherwise rugged world. Sweet foods were rare luxuries, and this pie gave settlers a chance to enjoy a treat that felt indulgent, even if it was born out of necessity. It became especially tied to French-Canadian tradition, where molasses was widely used in cooking and baking. Yet molasses pie wasn't just a pioneer dish. It carried on into the Great Depression, when families once again relied on inexpensive sweets to brighten hard times. For many older Canadians, the memory of molasses pie is tied to family gatherings, where even during lean years, there was always something sweet to share. Today, it's a dessert rarely seen outside heritage cookbooks. But for those who remember it, each bite recalls the resilience of Canadians who made joy out of scarcity.
No dish carried the spirit of French Canada into pioneer taverns more than torture, a savory meat pie that was as much a tradition as it was a meal. Typically made with minced pork or a blend of meats, sometimes including game like venison, it was seasoned with cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg. Wrapped in a flaky pastry crust, the pie was baked until golden-hued and hearty enough to feed hungry families or tavern guests. For celebrations like Christmas, torture became a centerpiece, but it was also served in taverns along major travel routes, offering a filling slice of comfort for weary travelers. For French-Canadian settlers, serving this dish in taverns reinforced their cultural roots and preserved traditions, even as new influences shaped pioneer life. For English-speaking settlers and immigrants, it offered a taste of something unique to Canada, an introduction to flavors they had never encountered back home. In taverns, it was both practical and profitable. One large pie could serve many portions, and it held up well when reheated for passing guests. But torture also carried nostalgia that reached far beyond taverns. For many, it represented family gatherings, warmth, and celebration in the midst of long winters. Its aroma of spiced meat-filled kitchens, embedding itself in memory. Even today, some Canadians recall their grandmother's torture as the dish that defined holidays, while others remember it as a rare tavern treat during a cold journey. It's one of the few pioneer foods that still holds a place on modern tables, connecting the past to the present. 10. Butter tarts. Few foods can claim the title of Canada's dessert, but butter tarts come close. Sticky, sweet, and perfectly simple, they were the little indulgence that brightened even the roughest pioneer days. Using just a handful of ingredients, sugar, butter, syrup, and eggs, settlers created a dessert that was cheap, easy, and deeply satisfying. Poured into small pastry shells, the filling baked into a gooey center, sometimes studded with raisins or nuts. In taverns, butter tarts were a prized offering, easy to make in batches and popular with travelers looking for something sweet to pair with tea or coffee. Unlike elaborate European pastries, butter tarts were uniquely Canadian, born out of necessity, yet bursting with flavor. They symbolized ingenuity, proving that even limited supplies could create something memorable. In taverns, they offered comfort and a touch of luxury, especially for travelers who hadn't tasted a dessert in weeks. Over time, they became a cultural staple, passed from tavern kitchens to family cookbooks, and eventually celebrated at festivals and bakeries across the country. For many Canadians, butter tarts hold a powerful nostalgia. Some remember sticky fingers from childhood kitchens. Others recall road trips where butter tarts were a must-have stop at rural bakeries. And while debates still rage, should they be runny or firm, raisins, or plain what's clear is that butter tarts connect generations. They remind us of the sweetness that survived even in times of hardship, carrying forward the spirit of pioneer resilience in a bite-sized treat.
8. Maple toddy. On a freezing night in a drafty tavern, nothing warmed the body or the spirit like a maple toddy. Sweet, smoky, and spiked, it was the drink that kept Canada's pioneers going. The toddy, a warm alcoholic drink, was popular across Britain and Europe, but in Canada, it took on a distinctly local twist. Instead of relying on imported sugar, tavern keepers sweetened their brews with maple syrup or maple sugar, products that were abundant thanks to indigenous traditions of maple tapping. The drink typically mixed hot water, spirits like rum or whiskey, and a generous spoonful of maple syrup. Sometimes spices like nutmeg or cloves were added when available, making it a rustic but comforting tavern favorite. The maple toddy reflected Canada's unique identity. It blended European drinking culture with indigenous-sourced maple to create something that felt distinctly Canadian. For weary travelers, it wasn't just about the taste, it was about the warmth. In drafty log taverns where winter wines held outside, a steaming mug of maple toddy thawed frozen fingers and lifted spirits.
If there was one dish that could warm a traveler from the inside out, it was beef and barley soup. Barley was among the earliest grains brought by European settlers to Canada. The cool climate was perfect for growing barley, which they used to make bread, beer, and, most memorably, soup. When combined with beef bones or chunks of salted beef, onions, carrots, and herbs, the result was a thick, savory broth that could feed many. In pioneer taverns, a large pot of beef and barley soup would often simmer over the hearth all day, its aroma welcoming newcomers the moment they stepped inside. This dish wasn't just food, it was nourishment for both body and spirit. Barley added bulk and nutrition at a time when fresh produce was scarce. Beef provided protein and strength. For tavern keepers, it was a cheap, filling meal that could be easily replenished as new guests arrived. For travelers, it offered comfort, reminding them of hearth and home even when they were hundreds of miles away. In many ways, beef and barley soup became the unofficial tavern dish of pioneer Canada, sustaining both locals and passers-by. But this soup also carried a story of resilience. For families, it was often made from scraps, bones, gristle, and whatever was left after butchery. What might have been waste was transformed into a meal that tasted like abundance. Today, many Canadians still recall grandmothers ladling out steaming bowls of beef and barley soup, the flavor tied to memories of comfort, simplicity, and care. It reminds us that some of the most enduring foods are born not from luxury, but from resourcefulness. 12. Rye bread loaves. If bannock was the quick bread of the frontier, then rye bread was the sturdy backbone of the tavern table. Dense, hearty, and built to last through harsh Canadian winters. Brought to Canada by European settlers, especially those from Eastern Europe and Germany, rye thrived in poor soil and could withstand frost, making it a reliable grain for pioneer bakers. Taverns often bake large, heavy loaves of rye bread to serve alongside stews, soups, and roasted meats. Its firm texture and deep, slightly sour flavor came from traditional sourdough fermentation, which also helped preserve the bread for days at a time. For settlers, rye bread also connected them to their European traditions while adapting to the realities of Canadian pioneer life. What makes rye bread so memorable isn't just its taste, it's the stories it carries. Generations of Canadians recall loaves baked in iron pots or hearth ovens, the smell of fresh bread filling drafty taverns and cabins. For many, it was a reminder of home, of shared meals, and of hard work rewarded with simple pleasures. Rye bread stands as a testament to how the most basic foods can hold the deepest nostalgia. But tavern tables weren't complete without something to pickle and preserve. Enter pickled vegetables, the crunchy, tangy staples that brightened winter meals. 13. Pickled vegetable. In a world without refrigeration, preservation was key, and pickled vegetables were the colorful, tangy saviors of Canadian Pioneer Taverns. Cabbage, cucumbers, carrots, and other root vegetables were staples in Canadian Pioneer kitchens. To survive the harsh winters, settlers learned to pickle vegetables in brine or vinegar, creating foods that could last for months. Taverns stocked jars of pickled vegetables behind the counter, offering patrons crunchy, flavorful accompaniments to their hearty meals. The process itself was simple, yet effective. Vegetables were cleaned, sliced, and submerged in a salty or sour solution, sometimes flavored with herbs and spices. For many Canadians, pickled vegetables carry nostalgic memories of family tables and winter pantries. The smell of sour cabbage or brine might remind older generations of childhood kitchens where women labored over barrels of preserved foods to see families through the cold months. Beyond sustenance, pickled vegetables represent ingenuity and resilience, the ability to turn simple ingredients into something lasting, flavorful, and most importantly, vital to survival. While pickles added crunch and tang to tavern fare, they also offered rich, meaty feasts from the wild, starting with the ever-popular roast goose or duck. 14. Roast goose or duck. Nothing announced a special meal in a pioneer tavern quite like the aroma of roast goose or duck, slowly turning over the fire, crisping skin, and filling the air with rich, savory scents. Waterfowl were plentiful across Canada's lakes, rivers, and wetlands, making geese and ducks a common catch for settlers. Taverns near hunting grounds would often serve these birds roasted whole over open flames or in brick ovens. Prepared with simple seasonings like salt, herbs, and sometimes a glaze of maple syrup or honey, these roasts were hearty and indulgent, providing protein and warmth during the cold months. For many tavern goers, it was a rare chance to enjoy a meal beyond stews, soups, and breads. Roast goose or duck wasn't everyday fare, it was a celebration of Canada's natural abundance. In taverns, these birds became a mark of generosity and hospitality. Patrons could savor flavors directly from the wilderness, connecting diners to the land around them. For hunters, it was also a way to share the fruits of the hunt with the community, reinforcing the tavern's role as a gathering place for stories, trade, and camaraderie. Yet the tradition also carried tension. Overhunting and changes in migration patterns sometimes made geese and ducks scarce, reminding settlers that nature's bounty was not limitless. Still, memories of roasting waterfowl over open hearths remain vivid in the stories of elders and tavern lore. The meal was not only nourishing, it was a symbol of survival, ingenuity, and the fleeting pleasures of pioneer life. 15. Fried salt pork with onions. Few foods define the pioneer tavern table like fried salt pork with onions. Simple, sizzling, and packed with the flavor and energy settlers needed to survive long, hard days. Salt pork was a cornerstone of Canadian frontier cuisine, cured in salt to preserve it without refrigeration. It could last for months and traveled well, making it ideal for taverns and long journeys. Taverns often sliced the pork thin and fried it with onions over open flames. The combination of rendered fat and caramelized onions created a rich, savory dish that could be served with bread, potatoes, or even mixed into a hash. This dish was both practical and satisfying. Salt pork provided protein and energy, while onions added flavor and a hint of freshness. For taverns, it was inexpensive to prepare and could feed large groups efficiently. Patrons, whether trappers, loggers, or travelers, depended on dishes like this to sustain them through physical labor and cold Canadian winters. Beyond sustenance, it also reflected a pioneer mindset, resourcefulness, simplicity, and maximizing what was available. For many Canadians, fried salt pork with onions evokes nostalgia for simpler times. The smell alone could trigger memories of taverns and family kitchens alike. Yet it also reminds us how survival shaped taste. What might seem overly salty or heavy today was once a treasured source of nourishment. It's a dish that connects modern Canadians to their ancestors' resilience, ingenuity, and ability to make the most of scarce resources. 16. Oatmeal porridge. Few foods were as humble and as comforting as a steaming bowl of oatmeal porridge, filling pioneer bellies and warming them before a long day in the Canadian wilderness. Oats thrived in Canada's cool climate and poor soils, making them a reliable grain for settlers. Porridge, made by boiling oats in water or milk, was a staple at both taverns and homes. Taverns often served it for breakfast or as a light supper, sometimes sweetened with molasses or maple syrup or enriched with dried fruits. Simple yet nourishing, oatmeal porridge required minimal ingredients but offered maximum energy for settlers and travelers alike. For farmers, loggers, and traders, it provided a warm, filling start to the day, fueling long hours of labor. In taverns, it was inexpensive, easy to prepare in large quantities, and versatile. Porridge could be served plain for those on tight budgets or enriched for guests who could afford a treat. Its widespread availability made it one of the most common and enduring pioneer foods across Canada. What makes oatmeal porridge so memorable isn't just its taste, it's the nostalgia it carries. Many older Canadians recall their grandparents' kitchens where the aroma of oats simmering over the stove signaled comfort, warmth, and care. Even in the harshest winters, a bowl of porridge represented home and nourishment. It's a dish that connects modern audiences to the perseverance and daily rhythms of early Canadian life. 17. Gingerbread loaves. Few treats could warm both the heart and the body like a slice of gingerbread loaf, fragrant, spiced, and baked to golden perfection in pioneer taverns. Gingerbread arrived in Canada with European settlers who adapted the recipe to local ingredients, combining molasses, a staple sweetener in pioneer kitchens, with flour, eggs, and spices like ginger, cinnamon, and cloves to create dense, flavorful loaves. Taverns baked large batches, often slicing them thick for patrons to enjoy with their tea or coffee. Easy to store and long-lasting, gingerbread loaves were perfect for frontier life where fresh baked goods were not always available. More than a dessert, gingerbread loaves were a comfort. In cold, rugged taverns, their warmth and sweet spice offered a small luxury in an otherwise harsh environment. They also reflected Canadian ingenuity. Simple ingredients were transformed into something aromatic, flavorful, and satisfying. For travelers, a slice of gingerbread loaf was a reminder of home, of tradition, and the generosity of tavern keepers who offered it alongside a hot beverage or hearty meal. Many Canadians today remember gingerbread loaves not only for their taste, but also for the memories they evoke, holiday gatherings, kitchen smells, and stories passed down through generations. In a time when sugar was scarce and luxuries rare, this simple loaf brought joy and connection. Even in the toughest of times, a little sweetness can go a long way. 18. Roasted carrots and turnips. Before exotic vegetables arrived, pioneer taverns relied on humble roots, roasted carrots and turnips that filled bellies and brought warmth to cold Canadian winters. Carrots and turnips were staples in early Canadian kitchens. They were prized for their hardiness and long shelf life, perfect for a time when fresh produce was scarce. Taverns would roast them over open flames or in brick ovens, sometimes tossed with drippings from meat or a touch of butter. This simple preparation made the vegetables soft, sweet, and slightly caramelized, a perfect complement to heavier main courses like stews, roasts, or fried pork. But it wasn't just about the flavor. Roasted carrots and turnips were practical and economical. They provided essential vitamins and calories during months when fresh produce was scarce. For tavern patrons, they added texture and flavor to otherwise heavy meals. And they reminded the settlers of the bounty of the harvest, a time when meals were shared by firelight and food was more than just sustenance. It was memory, comfort, and connection. 19. Cranberry preserves. In the heart of Canadian forests, a small tart berry grew wild and free. It was the cranberry. For centuries, indigenous peoples harvested cranberries as a source of food and medicine long before European settlers arrived. But when they did arrive, they quickly adopted the cranberry into their cuisine, using sugar or molasses to preserve its tartness for year-round enjoyment. By the 1800s, cranberry preserves were a beloved staple, served in taverns alongside bread, biscuits, or butter tarts. They added a burst of sweet, tangy flavor to the most basic of meals. The preparation was simple, yet labor-intensive. Berries had to be cleaned, cooked down with sweeteners, and stored in jars to last through the winter months. But cranberry preserves were more than just a condiment. They were a versatile addition to pioneer cuisine, balancing the richness of meats, the heartiness of breads, and the sweetness of pastries. For settlers and travelers alike, they represented a taste of home, a reminder of the bounty that could be found in the wild places of this new country. More than anything, cranberry preserves carry with them a deep sense of nostalgia, a reminder of simpler times, and a taste of Canada's wild heritage. Welcome to my channel. In the heart of pioneer Canada, where the forests and fields stretched as far as the eye could see, there was no shortage of wild game. And one of the most prized catches was the rabbit or hare. So when the snow began to fall and the temperature dropped, what better way to stay warm than with a steaming bowl of rabbit or hare stew? In this video, we will explore how these humble ingredients were transformed into a tavern tradition. We Lions discover how the resourceful pioneers made the most of their surroundings and how the simple act of sharing a meal brought people together in the face of adversity. So grab a mug, settle in, and let us take a journey back to pioneer Canada and find out how rabbit and hare stew became more than just a meal, but a symbol of survival resilience and the pioneer spirit. 21. Maple sugar candies. Few treats capture the essence of Canada like maple sugar candies, sweet, golden, and a direct gift from the maple forests that sustained our settlers for generations. You see, maple sugar was harvested by indigenous peoples long before European settlers arrived. And when they did arrive, they quickly adopted the practice of tapping maple trees for their sweet sap. By boiling down the sap into thick syrup and then crystallizing it, they created small, hard candies that could be stored and transported easily. So when travelers came through, taverns would often sell or serve these candies to weary travelers as a little pick-me-up. But maple sugar candies were more than just a treat. They were practical. They required no refrigeration, could survive the harshest travel conditions, and provided a natural, high-energy snack for both kids and adults. Their presence in taverns also symbolized Canadian ingenuity, using native resources to create a product that was both delicious and enduring. In every bite, they reinforced the connection between the settlers and the land that they inhabited. For many Canadians, maple sugar candies evoke a sense of nostalgia, of childhood winters, of hiking through the snow and cozy evenings spent at the tavern. They remind us of simpler times when life was tough and treats were rare and precious. Even today, maple sugar remains iconic. It is a culinary symbol of Canada's heritage and the creativity of our pioneering ancestors who turned sap from the trees into these golden delights. 22. Cornmeal porridge. Before coffee houses and cafes, Canadian pioneers started their day with a simple bowl of cornmeal porridge, warm, hearty, and packed with energy for the long hours ahead. Corn, brought to Canada through European and Indigenous exchanges, became a staple in pioneer diets. Ground into fine meal, it was boiled with water or milk to make a thick, nourishing porridge. Taverns often served it as a breakfast option, sometimes sweetened with molasses or maple syrup, or enriched with dried fruits or butter. Its preparation was simple, yet it offered sustenance and warmth, perfect for travelers starting early journeys or laborers heading into harsh conditions. Cornmeal porridge was practical and versatile. It could feed large groups, be stored easily, and required minimal ingredients, a necessity for frontier life. For tavern goers, it was a reliable way to start the day, providing lasting energy and comfort. Its popularity also reflected Canada's blending of Indigenous food knowledge with European culinary traditions, creating dishes uniquely adapted to the new environment. Many Canadians recall cornmeal porridge as a memory-laden dish associated with childhood, warmth, and family kitchens. Though simple, it symbolized endurance, adaptability, and the ability to thrive with limited resources. In a time when food was deeply tied to survival, a steaming bowl of porridge offered both nourishment and reassurance. Did you know that molasses cookies were a pioneer favorite? Back in the day, molasses was a cheap sweetener that had a long shelf life, so it was perfect for Canadian settlers. They would use it to make cookies that were sweet and chewy and full of spice. Can you imagine the smell of ginger, cinnamon, and cloves wafting through the air? These molasses cookies were a hit in taverns too. They were served as snacks for travelers, as accompaniments to tea or coffee, or just as a little luxury for children and families. The best part is they were super portable, so they could be enjoyed on the go or saved for a special occasion. For the pioneers, molasses cookies were more than just a treat. They were a source of calories and warmth and comfort. In a world where life was hard and ingredients were scarce, these cookies were a simple pleasure that reminded them of home. Today, we remember molasses cookies as a nostalgic taste of our childhood or our family kitchens. The smell of spices and sweet syrup takes us back to a time when life was simpler and sweeter. Did you know that cornbread was a pioneer tavern staple? Back in the day, when settlers and travelers would stop by taverns for a bite to eat, they'd often be served up a golden, crumbly cornbread. This versatile bread could be served alongside a stew or soup or even a roasted meat. And it was made with just a few simple ingredients that were easy to come by: cornmeal, water or milk, sometimes eggs or fat, depending on the recipe. Corn was actually introduced to Canadian settlers by Indigenous peoples. They ground the corn into a meal and baked it into bread. And this bread became a staple of early Canadian cuisine. It had a slightly sweet and hearty flavor that was a nice complement to the savory main courses, and its dense texture meant that it could sustain travelers on their long journeys. For many Canadians, cornbread evokes a sense of nostalgia for family meals and community gatherings. The aroma of freshly baked cornbread recalls kitchens, taverns, and hearths where people shared food, stories, and warmth. It's a reminder that even simple, humble foods played a vital role in sustaining our ancestors. 25. Dried fruit compotes. Before refrigeration, the sweetness of summer had to be preserved. Enter dried fruit compotes, the colorful, tangy, and naturally sweet finale to many pioneer tavern meals. Canadians pioneers relied on preservation techniques to enjoy fruits year-round. Apples, berries, and plums were dried or stewed into compotes, often sweetened with molasses or maple syrup. Taverns would serve these compotes as a dessert, a topping for breads or pastries, or even stirred into porridge for added flavor and nutrition. They provided variety to the settlers' heavy diet and reminded them of home gardens and harvests past. For many Canadians, dried fruit compotes bring back fond memories of childhood kitchens and the smell of simmering fruit. They symbolize the ingenuity of pioneers who turned simple fruits into lasting memories and comforting meals. With their long shelf life and versatility, compotes were a kitchen staple, a sweet treat that made life a little easier and a lot more flavorful. And with that, we reach the end of our culinary journey through Canadian Pioneer Taverns.